Imagine standing on the walls of your city, looking out across the plain and seeing nothing but dust. A massive cloud of dust stretching from horizon to horizon, rising into the sky like a living thing. The sound reaches you before you can make out any details. Thunder. Not the thunder of a storm, but something worse. The thunder of 10,000 hooves pounding the earth. Then you see them, horsemen emerging from the dust cloud. Not hundreds, not thousands, tens of thousands. More than you can count. They move with impossible coordination, like a single organism with 10,000 parts. Their banners are black, marked with symbols you don't recognize. The sound grows louder. Your hands start to shake. You've heard the stories. Everyone has heard the stories. Cities obliterated, populations massacred down to the last child, rivers running red for days, mountains built from human skulls. You told yourself these were exaggerations, propaganda. No army could be that brutal. No conquest could be that total. But now they're here. The Mongols have arrived at your gates, and you realize with absolute certainty that every story you heard was true, probably worse than true. In that moment, before a single arrow is fired, before a single siege engine is assembled, the battle is already over. Your will to resist crumbles. Your certainty in your city's defenses evaporates. You look at the faces of the other defenders and see your own terror reflected back. The Mongols haven't had to kill anyone yet. They've already won. This was the reality faced by hundreds of cities across Asia, the Middle East, and Eastern Europe in the 13th century. The Mongol Empire, rising from the steppes of Mongolia under Genghis Khan and his successors, conquered the largest contiguous land empire in human history. At its height, Mongol territory stretched from the Pacific Ocean to Eastern Europe, from Siberia to the Persian Gulf, nearly 12 million square miles. More land than the Roman Empire ever controlled. More territory than Alexander the Great ever dreamed of conquering. They accomplished this in less than a century. A civilization that European and Chinese scholars dismissed as primitive horsemen, barely removed from barbarism, destroyed empires that had stood for centuries. They defeated the sophisticated armies of China with their hundreds of thousands of soldiers and advanced military technology. They crushed the powerful Khwarezmian Empire in Persia. They shattered the armies of Eastern Europe, defeating Polish, Hungarian, and German forces simultaneously. They brought the Islamic Caliphate of Baghdad to its knees, ending the Islamic Golden Age in a week of unspeakable carnage. How did they do it? The conventional explanations focus on Mongol military advantages, their superior horsemanship, honed from childhood on the steppes, their composite bows, capable of shooting arrows with deadly accuracy from horseback at full gallop, their mobility, armies that could cover 100 miles in a day when European armies struggled to manage 20, their discipline, organized into units of 10, 100, and 1,000 with ruthlessly efficient command structures. All of these factors mattered, but they don't explain the full scope of Mongol success, because the Mongols never had numerical superiority. When Genghis Khan attacked the Jin Empire in China, he commanded perhaps 1 million soldiers against an empire of 53 million people. When Mongol armies invaded Europe, they were outnumbered at virtually every major battle. They won anyway. Not occasionally, consistently, overwhelmingly. The real secret of Mongol conquest wasn't just military skill. It was their mastery of psychological warfare, their ability to destroy enemy morale before battle even began. The Mongols understood something that military theorists wouldn't fully articulate until centuries later. That fear is a weapon as powerful as any sword or arrow. That terror can defeat armies without killing a single soldier. That reputation, carefully cultivated and strategically deployed, can conquer cities more effectively than sieges. The Mongols didn't just wage war on battlefields. They waged war in the minds of their enemies. They created a system of psychological warfare so sophisticated so terrifyingly effective that its influence can still be seen in modern military doctrine. And the methods they used to break enemy will, to sow panic and despair, to make resistance seem futile before it began, these methods were far more disturbing than simple military superiority. The foundation of Mongol psychological warfare was deliberate cultivation of a reputation for absolute brutality. This wasn't accidental. It wasn't a byproduct of military necessity. It was systematic policy, carefully designed and ruthlessly implemented. Genghis Khan understood that if you want enemies to surrender without fighting, you need to make fighting seem worse than death itself. So the Mongols created a terror machine. When a city resisted Mongol demands for surrender, the response was total annihilation. Not just military defeat, not just the execution of soldiers and political leaders. Complete, systematic extermination of the entire population. Every man, woman, and child. Every animal. Every living thing. The historical sources describe these massacres in detail. It still shocks readers 8 centuries later. When the Persian city of Nishapur resisted Mongol forces in 1221, their revenge was apocalyptic. The city had killed Tukhokar, husband of Genghis Khan's daughter, during an earlier siege. This personal affront demanded a personal response. Genghis Khan's daughter herself reportedly requested that every living thing in Nishapur be killed. Not just killed, but beheaded, to ensure no wounded survivors could hide among the corpses. The Mongol army, led by Genghis Khan's son Tolui, spent 10 days carrying out this massacre. Medieval sources claim the death toll reached 1.7 million people. Modern historians debate this number, some suggesting it may have been exaggerated. But even conservative estimates place the dead at least 100,000 to 200,000. The entire population of a major city, gone. After the killing was done, the Mongol soldiers collected the severed heads and constructed them into pyramids. 3 pyramids. One for the heads of men, one for the heads of women, one for the heads of children. These pyramids of skulls stood for years afterward, visible from miles away. A monument to what happened to cities that resisted the Mongols. Even dogs and cats were hunted down and killed. The city's famous turquoise mines were destroyed. The agricultural systems that fed the surrounding region were demolished. Nishapur had been one of the great centers of Islamic culture and learning. After the Mongols finished with it, the city was a lifeless ruin surrounded by pyramids of human skulls. This wasn't an isolated incident. This was policy. The siege of Merv in 1221 followed a similar pattern. When Merv surrendered, trusting in Mongol promises of mercy, the Mongols divided the population among their soldiers. Each Mongol warrior was assigned a quota of civilians to execute. Sources claim each soldier was responsible for somewhere between 24 and 400 deaths, depending on the account. The total massacre may have killed anywhere from 700,000 to over 1 million people. Genghis Khan himself reportedly sat on a golden throne and watched the executions, turning mass murder into theater. At Baghdad in 1258, Genghis Khan's grandson Hulagu Khan besieged the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, the political and spiritual center of the Islamic world. When the city fell after a brief siege, the Mongols spent a week systematically butchering the population. Conservative estimates place the death toll at 200,000. Some sources claim 800,000. Others go as high as 2 million. The exact numbers are impossible to verify. What's certain is that the Mongol army killed so many people that the streets ran with blood corpses piled in massive heaps. Blocked roads and the stench of decomposition became so overwhelming that the Mongols themselves had to temporarily evacuate the city they just conquered. The House of Wisdom, one of history's greatest libraries, containing centuries of accumulated knowledge in philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and literature, was destroyed. The books were thrown into the Tigris River, so many books that the river ran black with ink for months. The destruction was so complete that Baghdad, which had been one of the world's great cities for 500 years, never fully recovered. These weren't heat of battle massacres. These weren't the unfortunate side effects of medieval warfare. These were calculated demonstrations of power, carefully designed to send a message that would spread throughout the known world. That message was simple. Resist the Mongols and your city will be erased from existence. Everyone you know will die. Your culture will be destroyed. Your civilization will become a cautionary tale. This reputation for total brutality was the foundation of Mongol psychological warfare. And it worked because it was true. The Mongols actually did what they said they would do. When they threatened complete destruction, they meant it literally. This created a psychological equation that defined Mongol conquests. Surrender immediately, and you might live. Surrender after showing any resistance, and you're dead. Fight seriously, and everyone in your city is dead. This wasn't an empty threat. It was a documented, verified historical pattern. Cities that opened their gates without resistance were usually spared wholesale massacre, though they still faced heavy tribute, loss of autonomy, and often the conscription of young men into Mongol armies. Cities that resisted briefly before surrendering faced selective massacres, usually of political and military leadership, and often of large portions of the male population. Cities that mounted serious resistance faced total annihilation. The Mongols would kill everyone, destroy everything, and salt the earth so nothing would grow there again. This created an incentive structure that made resistance seem irrational. Why fight when fighting guarantees not just defeat, but extinction? Why sacrifice your life and the lives of everyone you love for a cause that's already lost? The psychological pressure this created was immense. Defenders standing on city walls, watching the Mongol army approach, knew with absolute certainty what their future held if they resisted. They'd heard the stories. They'd probably spoken to refugees from destroyed cities. They knew the Mongols weren't bluffing. This knowledge eroded morale before the siege even began. It created divisions within besieged cities, between those willing to die fighting and those who wanted to surrender. It turned every military reversal into a potential catalyst for collapse, because each setback brought the certainty of massacre one step closer. But the Mongols didn't just rely on their reputation. They actively manipulated it, exaggerating their numbers and capabilities through sophisticated deception techniques. One of the most effective Mongol psychological tactics was making their armies appear much larger than they actually were. Mongol soldiers would tie branches to their horses' tails. As the cavalry rode, these branches would drag along the ground, kicking up enormous clouds of dust. From a distance, enemy scouts observing a Mongol army would see a dust cloud that suggested tens of thousands more soldiers than were actually present. The Mongols would also order each soldier to light multiple campfires at night. A Mongol force of 10,000 men might light 50,000 fires. Enemy reconnaissance looking down from hills or city walls would count the fires and conclude they faced an overwhelming horde. In one famous incident, Genghis Khan's army was preparing to battle the Nauman tribe. On the eve of battle, Genghis ordered each soldier to light 5 fires spread out over a wide area. The Naumans, seeing what appeared to be an impossibly large army, panicked and lost cohesion before the battle even began. The Mongols also used elaborate deceptions involving dummies dressed as soldiers and mounted on spare horses. A Mongol Tumen, a unit of 10,000 horsemen, might actually consist of 7,000 actual soldiers, but appear to be 15,000 or more. The Mongols maintained many spare horses. Each warrior typically had 4 or 5 mounts, allowing them to cover vast distances by rotating horses. But these spare horses also served a psychological purpose. Mounted with dummies and positioned correctly, they made Mongol forces appear far more numerous. These deceptions had practical and psychological functions. Practically, making your army appear larger might cause enemies to deploy their forces differently, stretching their lines thin or committing reserves too early. Psychologically, the effect was even more important. Facing what appeared to be an overwhelming force created despair. It made commanders second-guess their strategies. It made soldiers question whether survival was even possible. The Mongols also spread disinformation through elaborate intelligence networks. They employed spies throughout the territories they planned to invade, gathering information about enemy strengths, weaknesses, political divisions, and resource availability. But these networks also spread propaganda. Mongol agents would spread exaggerated stories about Mongol brutality, about cities that had been destroyed, about massacres that had occurred. Some of these stories were true. Some were exaggerated. Some were completely fabricated. The psychological effect was the same. By the time the Mongol army actually arrived at a target city, the population had already been softened by weeks or months of mounting terror. Rumors would circulate about the size of the approaching army, each telling making it larger. Stories would spread about what had happened to cities that resisted, each version more horrific than the last. Refugees from destroyed cities would arrive, carrying first-hand accounts of Mongol brutality. Travelers would report seeing pyramids of skulls, rivers choked with corpses, cities reduced to ash. This created a psychological environment where resistance seemed not just difficult, but pointless. If the Mongols were truly as unstoppable as the story suggested, what was the point of fighting? You'd just die. Everyone would die. Better to surrender, pay tribute, accept Mongol rule, and survive. The Mongols also employed psychological warfare through their diplomatic demands. Before attacking a city or kingdom, Mongol envoys would arrive with specific terms. Submit to Mongol authority, pay tribute, provide soldiers for Mongol campaigns, accept Mongol governors and residents in your territory, follow Mongol law, worship as you wish, but acknowledge Mongol political supremacy. Refuse these terms and face annihilation. The envoys would make this clear, often describing in detail what had happened to other cities that refused. The presentation of these demands was itself a form of psychological warfare. The envoys spoke with complete confidence, as though Mongol victory was inevitable, resistance was futile, and the only question was whether the target city would be intelligent enough to recognize reality. This presumption of victory was itself intimidating. It suggested that the Mongols possessed some knowledge, some certainty about the outcome, that local defenders lacked. Many cities, faced with these demands, would send their own envoys to investigate Mongol power, to try to assess whether the threats were serious. These envoys would be shown the Mongol army, would be told stories of Mongol conquests, would sometimes be taken to the ruins of destroyed cities so they could see firsthand what resistance meant. Then they'd return home and report what they'd seen. Often, their reports would erode confidence in resistance more effectively than any direct threat. When your own trusted envoys come back saying resistance is hopeless, that the Mongols really are as powerful and brutal as claimed, that fighting means certain death, political will to resist crumbles. The Mongols also exploited political and ethnic divisions within their target societies through sophisticated divide-and-conquer tactics. Before invading a region, Mongol intelligence networks would identify existing tensions, rival factions, ethnic groups that resented their current rulers, religious minorities that faced persecution, anyone who might see Mongol conquest as an opportunity rather than a threat. Then the Mongols would make specific appeals to these groups. When invading the Jin Empire in northern China, the Mongols first approached the Khitan people, who had been conquered by the Jin a century earlier. The Mongols presented themselves as liberators, come to restore the Khitan to power and avenge their subjugation. Many Khitans joined Mongol forces, providing local knowledge, language skills, and additional soldiers. This pattern repeated across Mongol conquests. In Persia, the Mongols exploited tensions between different Islamic dynasties. In Russia, they took advantage of divisions between rival principalities. In the Middle East, They appealed to Christians who had lived under Islamic rule, promising religious freedom and protection. These appeals were often cynical. The Mongols had no particular interest in restoring any conquered people to power. They were building a Mongol Empire, not liberating subject populations. But the promises served their purpose. By turning portions of the target population into collaborators, the Mongols weakened resistance, gained valuable intelligence, and reduced the effective size of enemy forces. The psychological impact extended beyond the immediate military advantages. When defenders looked around and saw members of their own society defecting to the Mongols, it created doubt and suspicion. If some people thought Mongol rule was preferable to their current situation, maybe the Mongols weren't simply monsters. Maybe resistance really was futile. This uncertainty was itself a weapon. The Mongols also used cultural and religious fears to amplify their psychological impact. To sedentary civilizations like China, Persia, and the Islamic world, the Mongols appeared as the embodiment of chaos. They came from the steppes, the empty lands beyond civilization. They lived in tents and moved constantly. They had no cities, no agriculture, no settled life. To urban societies that defined civilization as permanent settlement, architecture, written culture, and agricultural surplus, the Mongols seemed like a force of nature rather than a human society. The Mongols understood this perception and exploited it. They presented themselves as an unstoppable tide, a punishment sent by heaven for the sins of the civilized. This apocalyptic framing made resistance seem not just militarily futile, but cosmically predetermined. Some Mongol propaganda suggested that Genghis Khan had been chosen by the eternal blue sky, the supreme deity of Mongol religion, to rule the entire world. Opposition to the Mongols was therefore opposition to divine will. This religious framing had particular power in societies that took divine intervention seriously. If the Mongols were succeeding because heaven had ordained their conquest, then resistance was not just militarily hopeless, but spiritually wrong. This created psychological paralysis, especially among religious and political leaders who feared they might be opposing divine will. The Mongols also exploited superstition and portents. When natural disasters occurred, earthquakes, eclipses, unusual weather, Mongol agents would spread interpretations suggesting these were signs of heaven's displeasure with current rulers and support for Mongol conquest. When military setbacks occurred, Mongol propaganda would frame them as divine punishment for resistance. This supernatural dimension of Mongol psychological warfare made their conquests seem inevitable in ways that transcended military power. The Mongols employed calculated unpredictability to maximize psychological impact. After devastating one region, the Mongol army would sometimes completely disappear, vanishing back into the steppes for months or even years. This created a different kind of terror. When the Mongols were actively campaigning, at least you knew where they were and could prepare or flee. But when they disappeared, the threat became omnipresent and amorphous. Were they gone? Were they watching? Would they return tomorrow or in 10 years? This uncertainty prevented populations from rebuilding, from regaining confidence, from believing the threat had passed. Then, just as people began to hope the Mongols wouldn't return, they would reappear without warning, attacking from unexpected directions, hitting targets that seemed safely distant from previous Mongol campaigns. This pattern of disappearance and sudden return kept entire regions in a state of psychological siege, even when no Mongol army was visible. The Mongols also varied their tactics unpredictably. Sometimes they would honor surrender terms, treating cities that submitted peacefully with relative mercy. Other times they would massacre a city that had surrendered, violating their own promises. This unpredictability was itself a weapon. If surrender guaranteed survival, cities would surrender. If surrender guaranteed death, cities would fight to the end. But if surrender might lead to survival, or might lead to massacre, with no way to predict which, the uncertainty paralyzed decision-making. Defenders couldn't calculate risk rationally because the Mongol response wasn't consistent. Sometimes brutality seemed arbitrary, based on the mood of individual commanders, the strategic situation, or factors defenders couldn't understand or predict. This arbitrariness was terrifying in a way that consistent brutality wasn't. At least if you knew, resistance always meant death. You could make an informed choice. But if sometimes resistance was punished with death, and sometimes resistance led to negotiation, if sometimes surrender saved your city, and sometimes surrender just made you easier to kill, how could you make rational decisions? This psychological uncertainty was paralyzing. Another effective Mongol tactic was the deliberate creation of refugees. When the Mongols devastated a region, they would often allow some people to escape, to flee to neighboring cities and kingdoms. These refugees served multiple purposes. They reduced the population that needed to be controlled or fed in conquered territory. They carried news of Mongol brutality to unconquered regions, spreading terror ahead of the actual army. They overwhelmed the resources of neighboring states, straining their economies and reducing their ability to mount effective resistance when the Mongols eventually attacked them. And they created visible human evidence of what Mongol conquest meant. When thousands of desperate refugees arrived at your gates, telling stories of cities destroyed and populations slaughtered, their presence was more convincing than any written message or envoy's report. These people had lived through Mongol conquest. They bore physical and psychological scars. Their testimony was impossible to dismiss as exaggeration or propaganda. The Mongols also used hostages and prisoners in psychologically sophisticated ways. After conquering a city, the Mongols would often spare certain categories of people: skilled craftsmen, engineers, literate administrators, anyone with useful knowledge. These people would be taken back to Mongolia or resettled in other parts of the empire. This practice served economic and administrative purposes, transferring useful skills to Mongol territories. But it also served psychological purposes. The knowledge that skilled people might be spared created divisions within besieged cities, between those who thought they might survive conquest and those who knew they would be killed. It gave certain people incentive to facilitate Mongol victory, hoping to be among the survivors. The Mongols would also sometimes spare prisoners, specifically to send them back to their home territories as messengers. These survivors would carry first-hand accounts of what had happened, of what they had seen and experienced. Their testimony was devastating to morale. When your own soldiers return and tell you resistance is hopeless, that the Mongols are unstoppable, that everyone who fought is dead, it destroys willingness to fight. The Mongols also used prisoners as human shields during sieges. When attacking fortified cities, Mongol forces would often drive captured civilians ahead of their armies, forcing defenders to kill their own people if they wanted to resist. This created impossible moral dilemmas. Do you kill your own citizens to slow the Mongol advance? Do you refuse to fight and allow the Mongols to approach your walls unopposed? Either choice is psychologically devastating. This tactic also slowed the enemy's ability to mount effective defense. Defenders hesitated. They argued among themselves about what to do. The psychological weight of killing their own people, even to prevent Mongol conquest, was overwhelming. This hesitation created tactical advantages for Mongol attackers. The long-term psychological impact of Mongol conquest extended far beyond individual battles or sieges. The Mongols created a culture of fear that lasted for generations. In the Persian historical tradition, the Mongol invasions were remembered as an apocalypse, a civilizational catastrophe that destroyed the Islamic Golden Age and plunged the region into darkness. Historians writing a century after the invasions still describe the events with language of cosmic horror, comparing Mongol conquest to divine punishment or the end of the world. In China, the Mongol Yuan dynasty maintained control, partly through the memory of what had happened during the conquest. The Chinese population, having experienced or heard stories of Mongol brutality during the invasion, accepted Mongol rule partly out of fear of what resistance might provoke. The Mongols had demonstrated they were willing to commit genocide. That demonstration didn't need to be repeated. The memory was enough. In Russia, the Mongol invasions, remembered as the coming of the Golden Horde, shaped Russian political and cultural development for centuries. The experience of subjugation, of being powerless before an overwhelming force, became part of Russian historical consciousness. Even after Mongol power declined, the memory remained. This long-term psychological impact was itself a form of conquest. The Mongols didn't just defeat armies and capture territory. They defeated the will to resist, not just in the present, but in the future. By making their conquests so brutal, so total, so memorable, they created a legacy of fear that maintained Mongol power long after their military advantages had eroded. The Mongols also understood the importance of controlling narratives about their conquests. While they created terror through actual brutality, they also managed how that brutality was discussed and remembered. Mongol authorities would sometimes sponsor historians to write accounts of their conquests, ensuring that certain events were recorded in ways that emphasized Mongol power and inevitability. These official histories served as propaganda, both for contemporary audiences and for posterity. The Persian historian Juvayni, writing under Mongol patronage, produced detailed accounts of Mongol conquests that emphasized their overwhelming power and the futility of resistance. His histories were distributed throughout Mongol territories, serving as a kind of textbook for why submission to Mongol authority was not just necessary, but righteous. The Mongols were also skilled at adjusting their psychological warfare to different cultural contexts. In China, they emphasized their role as restorers of order after decades of Jin misrule. In Persia, they presented themselves as the scourge of God, punishing sinful rulers. In Russia, they appeared as unstoppable force of nature that must be accommodated rather than opposed. This cultural adaptability made Mongol psychological warfare more effective than a one-size-fits-all approach would have been. They understood that different societies had different fears, different values, different cultural frameworks for understanding conquest and power. By adapting their message to each target culture, they made their psychological warfare more penetrating and harder to resist. The economic dimension of Mongol psychological warfare is often overlooked. The Mongols would deliberately target economic infrastructure during their campaigns, destroying irrigation systems, burning crops, killing livestock, and demolishing trade networks. This created economic devastation that lasted far longer than the military campaign itself. A city that lost its agricultural hinterland couldn't feed itself. Regions that lost their trade routes couldn't sustain their economies. This economic destruction served military purposes, making regions unable to support armies or fund resistance. But it also served psychological purposes. Economic collapse created desperation. Desperate people are more willing to accept any authority that offers stability, even brutal Mongol authority. The promise of restored trade, functioning agriculture, and economic recovery became a carrot to balance the stick of threatened destruction. Populations living in economic ruins, surrounded by devastated farmland and collapsed trade networks, had strong incentive to accept Mongol rule if it meant economic reconstruction. The Mongols were also strategic about reconstruction. After devastating a region, they would sometimes invest in rebuilding it, restoring irrigation, encouraging trade, providing security for merchants. This created a stark contrast. Resist and face destruction. Submit and potentially prosper. This contrast made Mongol rule seem preferable to the chaos of resistance, even though the Mongols themselves had created that chaos in the first place. The Mongol system of post-conquest governance reinforced their psychological warfare. After conquering a region, the Mongols typically implemented a relatively light administrative touch. Local rulers could often remain in power if they accepted Mongol overlordship, paid tribute, provided soldiers when requested, and followed Mongol strategic directives. This system meant that daily life under Mongol rule might not be dramatically different from life before conquest, at least for populations that fully submitted. This created an important psychological dynamic. If you resisted and were conquered, you died. If you submitted and the Mongols conquered your neighbors, you lived and might even prosper, as Mongol rule brought security and expanded trade networks. This incentivized not just submission, but active cooperation with Mongol expansion. Populations that had submitted early became invested in Mongol success, because Mongol failure might mean their former enemies would punish them for collaboration. The Mongols also exploited competitive dynamics between rival powers. When multiple kingdoms or cities existed in a region, the Mongols would offer favorable terms to whichever submitted first. This created a race to surrender, as rulers tried to secure better deals than their rivals would get. This competition to submit undermined any possibility of collective resistance. Rather than uniting against the Mongol threat, rival powers competed to surrender most quickly and completely. The Mongols also used selective mercy to reinforce psychological lessons. After a particularly brutal massacre, the Mongols would sometimes spare a specific category of people, craftsmen, or religious leaders or merchants, and treat them well. These survivors would spread the message that the Mongols weren't simply mindless destroyers. They punished resistance but rewarded cooperation. This created hope that submission might actually lead to survival, making surrender more palatable. The Mongols understood the importance of speed in psychological warfare. Their armies moved with incredible swiftness, covering vast distances far faster than their enemies expected. This speed had tactical advantages, allowing Mongols to attack from unexpected directions and to retreat before enemies could mass forces against them. But it also had psychological impact. The suddenness of Mongol attacks created a sense that they could appear anywhere, anytime, without warning. This made defense seem impossible because you couldn't predict where or when the attack would come. The speed of Mongol campaigns also prevented enemies from organizing collective resistance. Before one kingdom could send help to another, the Mongols had already won. Before alliances could form, the Mongols had moved on to new targets. This rapid-fire conquest created psychological isolation. Each city or kingdom faced the Mongols seemingly alone, without hope of assistance, making resistance feel futile. The Mongols also understood the psychological value of consistency in following through on threats. When they said they would destroy a city that resisted, they actually did it. This reliability made their threats credible in ways that empty bluster never could. Enemies knew with certainty that Mongol warnings weren't negotiating positions or psychological gambits. They were statements of fact. This certainty was terrifying. You couldn't call their bluff because they weren't bluffing. You couldn't hope they wouldn't really follow through with total destruction because history proved they absolutely would. The psychological warfare conducted by the Mongols created a framework where military resistance became not just difficult, but irrational. The calculus was simple and terrible. Fight and die with certainty. Surrender and possibly live. For most people, for most cities, the choice became obvious, even though it meant accepting subjugation to a foreign power. The Mongols created conditions where survival required submission. This was psychological warfare at its most effective, using terror, deception, and strategic brutality to make conquest seem inevitable and resistance seem suicidal. The legacy of Mongol psychological warfare extends far beyond the medieval period. Modern military theorists studying the Mongols have recognized the sophistication of their approach, the deliberate cultivation of reputation as a strategic asset, the systematic use of terror to reduce resistance, the exploitation of intelligence networks to spread disinformation and propaganda, the targeting of civilian morale as a strategic objective. These concepts have all been incorporated into modern military doctrine. The United States military studied Mongol tactics during the Cold War, particularly their use of psychological operations and their strategy of shock and awe. The idea that overwhelming force, rapidly applied, could break enemy will without prolonged conflict. This comes partly from Mongol examples. The Mongols demonstrated that if you hit hard enough, fast enough, and terribly enough, enemy populations might surrender before you have to fight them. This principle has influenced modern strategic thinking about how wars are fought and won. But the Mongol example also demonstrates the costs of such warfare, both for those conquered and for history's judgment of the conquerors. The Mongol conquests were among the deadliest events in human history. Estimates vary wildly, but scholarly consensus suggests Mongol campaigns may have killed somewhere between 30 and 40 million people, roughly 5 to 11% of the world's population at the time. Some regions never fully recovered. The Islamic Golden Age ended with the sack of Baghdad. The population of Persia may have taken centuries to return to pre-Mongol levels. The psychological scars lasted even longer. The memory of Mongol brutality became embedded in the cultural consciousness of the societies they conquered. For centuries afterward, Mongol was synonymous with destructive barbarism. The historical reputation of Genghis Khan and his successors remains contested. In Mongolia, Genghis Khan is a national hero, the founder of the Mongol nation, a brilliant military and political leader who united fractious tribes and built an empire. In the West, he's increasingly recognized as a complex figure whose empire, despite its violence, had significant positive effects, promoting trade, cultural exchange, and religious tolerance within Mongol territories. But in the Middle East, Persia, Russia, and parts of China, the historical memory remains overwhelmingly negative. The Mongols are remembered as destroyers, as the embodiment of conquest at its most brutal. This divergent memory reflects different relationships to Mongol power. For those who inherited the Mongol Empire, the violence was a regrettable but necessary part of state building. For those who suffered under Mongol conquest, the violence was trauma that shaped cultural identity for generations. The psychological warfare that made Mongol conquest so effective also made historical forgiveness nearly impossible. You can forgive defeat. You can forgive being conquered by a more powerful force. It's much harder to forgive systematic terror, deliberate massacres, the calculated use of fear as a weapon of war. The very effectiveness of Mongol psychological warfare created historical memory that has never fully healed. When modern military forces employ psychological operations, when they use shock and awe tactics, when they cultivate reputations for overwhelming power, they are following in the Mongols' footsteps, whether they acknowledge it or not. The Mongols demonstrated that wars are won as much in the minds of enemies as on battlefields. That fear can be as effective a weapon as any technology. That reputation, carefully crafted and strategically deployed, can multiply military power far beyond its actual strength. But the Mongol example also demonstrates the moral hazards of such warfare. When you build power on terror, when you conquer through psychological manipulation and systematic brutality, you may achieve short-term military success. But you also create wounds that never fully heal, memories that never fully fade, and a historical reputation that can never be fully rehabilitated. The pyramids of skulls at Nishapur stood for years as monuments to Mongol power. Today they exist only in historical records, terrifying footnotes in the story of one of history's most successful empires. But the psychological impact of those pyramids, the message they sent, the fear they instilled, that has echoed through 8 centuries. Every time a military force uses terror as a weapon, every time psychological warfare targets civilian morale, every time reputation is cultivated through systematic brutality, the ghost of Mongol warfare is present. This is the true legacy of Mongol psychological warfare. Not just that it was effective, but that it demonstrated how warfare itself could be transformed from physical contest into psychological campaign. The Mongols understood that the most powerful weapon isn't the one that kills the most enemies, but the one that makes enemies unwilling to fight in the first place. They mastered this weapon in ways that still inform military thinking today, and they paid the price in historical memory that will probably never forgive them fully for how effectively they used fear to conquer the world. So why were the Mongols so terrifying? Why do their conquests, 8 centuries later, still represent a pinnacle of military brutality and psychological warfare? Because they understood something fundamental about human psychology and warfare. They understood that humans are not primarily rational actors calculating military odds. We are emotional beings, driven by fear and hope, by the desire to survive and protect those we love. The Mongols weaponized these fundamental human drives. They created a system where fear became more powerful than courage, where the rational choice was surrender, where resistance required not just bravery, but something close to suicidal desperation. They turned psychological warfare into a science before such a term existed, implementing principles that military theorists would only articulate centuries later. The most terrifying aspect of Mongol warfare wasn't their composite bows, or their cavalry tactics, or their organizational efficiency. It was their systematic approach to breaking human will. They studied their enemies, not just militarily, but psychologically. They understood what different cultures feared most and exploited those fears. They recognized that reputation could be cultivated and deployed strategically. They knew that the fear of what might happen could be more paralyzing than what actually happened. This understanding made them nearly unstoppable for nearly a century. Cities and kingdoms that should have been able to resist, that had the walls and soldiers and resources to mount effective defenses, collapsed because the psychological warfare had already defeated them before the siege began. The Mongols created a world where the very approach of their army was enough to trigger surrender, where the sight of their banners on the horizon meant the battle was already lost, where resistance itself seemed like madness rather than courage. The historical sources from the period of Mongol conquests are filled with descriptions of paralysis, of leaders unable to decide on courses of action, of populations gripped by terror, of the complete collapse of morale. The Arab historian Ibn al-Athir, writing about the Mongol invasions, described people so terrified that a single Mongol horseman could enter a village of hundreds and kill everyone one by one because no one would dare resist. Whether literally true or not, this image captures the psychological reality of Mongol conquest. The fear was so overwhelming that normal human responses, fight or flight, self-defense, collective action, all of these collapsed. The Mongols created conditions where terror itself became the primary weapon. The massacres at Nishapur, Morbid, Baghdad, and countless other cities were real. The violence was genuine. The brutality was historical fact. But the purpose of that violence extended far beyond the immediate military objectives. Each massacre was an investment in future conquest. Every pyramid of skulls was a message to the next city. Every slaughtered population was a demonstration that the threats were real. The Mongols killed tens of thousands, perhaps millions, in part so they wouldn't have to kill tens of millions. If you make your reputation fearsome enough, most people surrender without fighting. This is the cold logic of terror as strategy. You commit atrocities so extreme that they prevent future resistance. You demonstrate such overwhelming brutality that fighting seems pointless. You create such certain consequences for resistance that submission becomes the only rational choice. From a purely strategic standpoint, it worked brilliantly. The Mongol Empire conquered more territory with fewer soldiers than perhaps any empire in history. They did it by making fear work for them, by ensuring that their reputation did as much work as their armies. But this strategy had profound moral implications. The Mongols deliberately made warfare more psychologically devastating. They elevated terror from a side effect of conquest to a primary strategic tool. They systematically targeted civilian populations, not for military necessity, but for psychological impact. They transformed massacre from an ugly reality of medieval warfare into a calculated instrument of policy. When we remember the Mongol conquests today, when we study their military tactics, when we analyze their psychological warfare, we're confronting uncomfortable questions about the nature of power and the ethics of warfare. The Mongols were successful, extraordinarily successful. They built the largest land empire in human history. But their success came at a cost, measured not just in bodies, but in psychological trauma that echoed through generations. The historical record forces us to acknowledge that their methods worked. Terror was effective. Psychological warfare achieved strategic objectives. The cultivation of a fearsome reputation multiplied military power. These are empirical facts that military historians can't ignore. But the historical record also forces us to confront the human cost. The millions dead, the civilizations destroyed, the cultural treasures lost forever, the psychological scars that never healed, the societies that took centuries to recover, if they recovered at all. This is the haunting reality of Mongol psychological warfare. It achieved its objectives, but left a trail of destruction that still marks the historical landscape. The ruins of cities the Mongols destroyed remain ruins 8 centuries later. The cultural discontinuities they created, the sudden end of the Islamic Golden Age, the lasting impact on Persian and Middle Eastern development, the transformation of the geopolitical landscape of Asia, these effects persist into the present. The Mongols demonstrated that psychological warfare could be devastatingly effective. They also demonstrated that such warfare creates costs that extend far beyond the immediate military campaign, costs that compound over generations, costs that can never be fully calculated or repaired. When we examine Mongol psychological warfare today, we see techniques that have been refined and sanitized but remain recognizably similar. Modern militaries use psychological operations to demoralize enemies, to encourage surrender, to undermine will to resist. They cultivate reputations for overwhelming power. They employ shock and awe tactics designed to break enemy morale before extended combat becomes necessary. They understand, as the Mongols did, that wars are won as much through psychological dominance as through physical force. The difference is primarily one of scale and method. Modern military forces operate under international laws that prohibit many of the tactics the Mongols used. The Geneva Conventions forbid targeting civilians, collective punishment, destruction of cultural heritage, and many other practices that were central to Mongol warfare. Modern warfare, at least in theory, distinguishes between combatants and non-combatants in ways that the Mongols never did. But the underlying logic persists. If you can make your military power seem so overwhelming that resistance appears futile, you can win wars without fighting all the battles. If you can break enemy morale, you don't have to kill all the enemy soldiers. If you can make the costs of resistance seem unbearable, populations will surrender. This logic, refined and systematized by the Mongols 8 centuries ago, remains central to military thinking today. The tools have changed. Modern militaries use precision weapons, electronic warfare, cyber operations, information warfare, and sophisticated propaganda. But the objective remains the same that the Mongols pursued: break the enemy's will to resist, make fighting seem irrational, create psychological conditions where surrender is the only logical choice. When modern military strategists talk about winning hearts and minds, they're engaging in a form of psychological warfare that the Mongols would have recognized instantly. The language is more palatable. The methods are less overtly brutal, but the goal is identical. Control the psychological space. Shape how populations think about the conflict. Make your victory seem inevitable and their resistance seem futile. The Mongol example is studied in military academies, not because modern forces want to replicate Mongol brutality, but because the Mongols understood principles of warfare that transcend any particular historical period or technological context. They understood that perception matters as much as reality. That fear is a force multiplier. That reputation is a strategic asset. That breaking enemy will can be more important than breaking enemy armies. These insights remain valid regardless of how much technology has advanced or how much international law has evolved. The ethical questions raised by Mongol warfare also remain relevant. When does psychological warfare cross the line from legitimate military tactics to war crimes? How do you balance military effectiveness against humanitarian concerns? What costs in human suffering are acceptable in pursuit of strategic objectives? These questions don't have easy answers. The Mongol example is extreme, making it easier to judge their methods as beyond acceptable bounds. But the principles they employed exist on a continuum. Modern militaries that cultivate fearsome reputations, that use overwhelming force to discourage resistance, that employ psychological operations to undermine enemy morale, all of these are engaging in forms of psychological warfare that differ from Mongol methods in degree rather than kind. This doesn't mean modern warfare is equivalent to Mongol conquest. The differences in scale, method, and ethical constraint are significant and real. But it does mean that the Mongol example forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about warfare itself. That fear is a weapon. That psychological manipulation can be effective. That targeting civilian morale can achieve strategic objectives. That terror, when systematically employed, can multiply military power. These truths don't stop being true just because we find them disturbing. The Mongols also demonstrated something that military planners still grapple with today. That short-term strategic success achieved through terror and psychological warfare can create long-term strategic problems. The Mongol Empire eventually fragmented. The conquered populations never fully accepted Mongol rule. Rebellions were constant. The psychological dominance that facilitated conquest couldn't sustain empire indefinitely. Once populations recovered from the initial shock, once the immediate terror faded, once people realized that Mongol power, while great, was not actually infinite or invincible, resistance emerged. The Yuan dynasty in China was overthrown after less than a century. The Ilkhanate in Persia collapsed into civil war. The various Mongol successor states fought each other as often as they fought external enemies. The terror that had built the empire couldn't hold it together forever. This pattern has repeated throughout history. Empires built primarily on force and fear eventually collapse because they never gain genuine legitimacy. Populations submit out of terror, but never truly consent. The moment central power weakens, rebellion erupts. Terror can conquer, but it can't govern indefinitely. The Mongols learned this lesson, though perhaps not in time to prevent their empire's fragmentation. Later Mongol rulers attempted to cultivate legitimacy through patronage of local religions, adoption of local administrative systems, and integration into the cultures they had conquered. The terror tactics that facilitated conquest were gradually abandoned as Mongol leaders recognized they needed something more than fear to sustain their rule. But by then, the historical reputation had been established. The Mongols would forever be remembered primarily for their brutality, not for the trade networks they protected, or the religious tolerance they practiced, or the cultural exchanges their empire facilitated. This is perhaps the ultimate cost of warfare based on terror. You may achieve your immediate objectives, but you create a historical legacy that can never be fully redeemed. The pyramids of skulls crumble to dust, but the memory of them persists. The massacres end, but the stories of them are told for centuries. The empire falls, but the fear it created echoes through time. The story of Mongol psychological warfare is ultimately a story about the dark side of human ingenuity. The Mongols were brilliant. They recognized truths about warfare and human psychology that others missed. They systematized approaches to conquest that were devastatingly effective. They built an empire that dominated a quarter of the human race. And they did it primarily through fear. This brilliance doesn't excuse the brutality. Understanding the strategic logic of Mongol terror doesn't make the massacres acceptable. Recognizing the effectiveness of their psychological warfare doesn't justify the human cost, but it does force us to acknowledge uncomfortable realities about warfare, power, and human nature. Humans are capable of systematic cruelty in pursuit of strategic objectives. We can rationalize atrocities as necessary for larger goals. We can build elaborate intellectual frameworks that justify terror as policy. We can convince ourselves that the ends justify the means, that strategic success excuses moral failure, that winning matters more than how we win. The Mongols didn't invent these tendencies. They just perfected their application in ways that still shock us 8 centuries later. Every generation faces the question of what costs are acceptable in pursuit of security, power, and strategic advantage. The Mongol example provides a stark case study. They achieved their strategic objectives completely. They built an empire that dominated the known world. They demonstrated that psychological warfare and systematic terror could be extraordinarily effective military tools. They also created human suffering on a scale that still staggers the imagination. They destroyed civilizations, massacred populations, and traumatized societies in ways that took centuries to heal, if they healed at all. They traded moral legitimacy for strategic success and discovered that empires built on terror eventually collapse under the weight of their own brutality. This is the ultimate lesson of Mongol psychological warfare. It worked terrifyingly well, but it also demonstrated the limits of power based purely on fear. You can conquer the world through terror, but you can't hold it forever. You can break human will through systematic brutality, but eventually that will recovers and turns to resistance. You can multiply your military power through psychological warfare, but you also multiply the resentment and hatred that will eventually be directed against you. The Mongol Empire was the largest land empire in human history. It was also one of the shortest-lived of the great empires. These two facts are related. The methods that built the empire prevented it from lasting. The terror that facilitated conquest undermined long-term stability. The psychological warfare that broke enemy resistance created populations that would never truly accept Mongol rule. When we study Mongol warfare today, we're studying both a triumph and a tragedy. A triumph of strategic thinking, military organization, and psychological manipulation. A tragedy of human suffering, cultural destruction, and the demonstration that might, no matter how overwhelming, cannot create lasting legitimacy. The dust clouds on the horizon are gone. The thunder of hooves has faded. The pyramids of skulls have crumbled. The Mongol Empire exists only in historical memory and archaeological ruins, but the questions it raises persist. How do we balance effectiveness against ethics in warfare? What costs in human suffering are acceptable in pursuit of strategic objectives? Can power based primarily on fear ever be sustainable? What do we owe to those who suffer as collateral damage in geopolitical conflicts? These questions don't have simple answers. The Mongol example doesn't provide clear guidance, only a stark illustration of what happens when military effectiveness is pursued without meaningful ethical constraints. It shows us both the possibilities and the dangers of psychological warfare, taken to its logical extreme. The most terrifying military tactics ever employed were terrifying precisely because they worked. The Mongols conquered more of the world than anyone before or since by making fear itself their primary weapon. They demonstrated that systematic terror, strategically applied, could achieve objectives that conventional military force alone could never accomplish. They also demonstrated that such achievements come at costs that echo through centuries, creating wounds that never fully heal and memories that never fully fade. This is why we remember the Mongols with such conflicted feelings. Admiration for their military genius mixed with horror at their methods. Recognition of their historical importance alongside revulsion at their brutality. Fascination with how they conquered the world combined with sorrow for how many died in that conquest. The Mongol Empire is gone. The methods they pioneered persist, refined and sanitized, but recognizably similar. Every military force that cultivates a fearsome reputation, that employs psychological operations, that uses overwhelming force to discourage resistance, is walking a path the Mongols mapped 8 centuries ago. The challenge for the modern world is to learn from the Mongol example without replicating their mistakes. To understand the effectiveness of psychological warfare without embracing the brutality that made it work. To recognize that fear is a weapon while also acknowledging that weapons based on fear create costs that extend far beyond the battlefield. The Mongols showed us what's possible when psychological warfare is pursued without constraint. They also showed us what such pursuit costs in human lives, in cultural destruction, in moral legitimacy, and in historical reputation. They won their wars and lost their humanity. They conquered the world and created a legacy that can never be fully redeemed. That is the final haunting truth about Mongol psychological warfare. It was the most effective military innovation of its era. It was also one of the most morally catastrophic. These two facts are inseparable. We cannot celebrate Mongol military genius without acknowledging Mongol brutality. We cannot study their tactics without confronting their costs. We cannot learn from their success without remembering their victims. The pyramids of skulls at Nishapur are gone, but they stand forever in historical memory as monuments to what humans can achieve when we apply all our intelligence, all our ingenuity, all our organizational skill to the pursuit of conquest through terror. The Mongols were brilliant. They were effective. They were successful beyond measure. And they created suffering beyond measure. This is the legacy we inherit when we study their warfare. Knowledge of methods that work. Understanding of psychological principles that remain true. And the inescapable moral burden of knowing that effectiveness and ethics are not the same thing that winning, and rightness are not synonymous, that the most terrifying military tactics ever employed were terrifying precisely because they achieved their objectives while destroying everything in their path.